Good morning, everybody. Thank you, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. Thank you for joining us. We're just waiting on a couple more people to join us here. If you wouldn't mind adding in the chat box while we're waiting on a few more folks, let us know how you heard about today's presentation. It's always good for us to hear how the word got out about our Berkshire Watershed Institutes. Just take another couple seconds here. Those of you that are here, I do want to let you know that this presentation is being recorded. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started. We have about half of our registered participants here. So thank you again, everybody. My name is Christina Medved. I'm the Director of Community Outreach with Roaring Fork Conservancy. I wanted to, first of all, thank Janice and Austin for being here with us this morning. So the other thing I wanted to do is to welcome all of you here. We have 17 different states represented. We have even 2 individuals from Brazil. So this is, I would say, the most far-reaching group that we've had for one of our virtual presentations in the last year. So thank you everybody for joining us. And because we have so many new people, I thought I would just take a few minutes to let you know a little bit of who Roaring Fork Conservancy is and where we're located and how we got to this point that we have Janice and Austin here presenting for us on microplastics. So for those of you that are familiar with the state of Colorado, we are actually on the western slope of Colorado. This little blue section here is our watershed and our area of focus. And we are actually a 24-year-old watershed organization. And our mission is to inspire people to explore, value, and protect the Roaring Fork watershed. And we fulfill our mission primarily through our watershed science and policy programs and our watershed education programs. So our science and policy programs includes everything from water quality monitoring to working with stakeholders on different water issues in the watershed. And our education program covers everything from pre-K to senior citizens. We do everything from classroom programs to offering fun field trips, both for students and adults on our rivers so that students can have a meaningful watershed experience. And in the last year has also included some virtual presentations. You can learn so much more about us on our website. I just don't have time to talk about it all today because I want to make sure that Janice and Austin have as much time to present their research. So a little bit about our watershed. Here. So our watershed is about 1,400 square miles. It's roughly the size of the state of Rhode Island. And we have 3 major rivers in our watershed. So the dark blue is actually the Roaring Fork River, and it begins here near Independence Pass, just upstream of the city of Aspen. And our other 2 tributaries are the Crystal River and the Frying Pan River. The orange sections you see here are our high elevation areas. And so all of our rivers, our 3 major rivers, I should say, begin in designated wilderness areas. And so we actually do have really good water quality here. And that's mostly because our rivers begin in beautiful forested headwaters. So if you haven't had a chance to maybe visit us and ski on our mountains or fish in our rivers, I'm willing to bet that you've seen one of the most famous places in our watershed, which is the Maroon Bells. This is considered one of the most photographed mountain ranges in North America. And this is here just outside of Aspen, actually. So here's the other neat thing about our watershed. We're not very big. We're actually about, as I mentioned, 1,400 square miles. What I should mention here is that while the Roaring Fork River begins here near Independence Pass, it ends here in Glenwood Springs where it flows into the Colorado River. And our watershed is only about 0.5% of the total land mass of the Colorado River Basin, but it contributes about 10% of the total flow to the Colorado River. And that is due mostly to our high mountains that can hold on to snow for a long time. So our primary water supply here is snow. It's about 80% of our water supply comes from snow. So, you know, given the remote nature of most of our watershed, about 33% of our watershed is designated wilderness areas. we were particularly interested in microplastics and how they're getting into these remote areas, how they're getting into our waterways. And so this is what brings us to today with having Janice Brahney and Austin Baldwin here with us and to present for the Berkshire Watershed Institute. And so about 2 years ago, we started the Berkshire Watershed Institute because we are an important headwater to the Colorado River. We felt like it was important to have conversations that were beyond the Roaring Fork Valley to invite water leaders to discuss their areas of research, to discuss different issues that they're researching in water, and to give everybody access to these water leaders. So we're really excited to have you all here. We have about 90 people registered here today. So just a little bit of housekeeping before we jump into Austin's presentation is that if you have a question, if you could please just drop it in the chat box, and I'll be the one that monitors the chat box, and we'll go ahead and let Austin and Janice know when that question is there. So we'll have Austin present first. His presentation will be about a half an hour, and then we'll have Janice present right after him. And then after that, we'll have opportunity for Q&A from all of you. So without any further delay, let me go ahead and introduce you all to our first presenter. I'm going to stop sharing here so Austin can get ready. So Austin Baldwin is a hydrologist with the U.S. Geological Survey Idaho Water Science Center, where he works on surface water and sediment quality studies throughout the U.S. In recent years, Austin has worked on several studies related to understanding microplastic sources, transport, fate, and biological uptake in freshwater environments. So we're so excited to have you here, Austin. The microphone is yours.
All right, thanks everybody. So I'm going to talk about microplastics in aquatic environments, kind of generally, both looking at occurrence and biological uptake. And I'm going to focus somewhat on a study that I worked on in Lake Mead, since Roaring Fork is part of the Colorado River Basin. All right, so quick overview. I'll talk about background on microplastics, different types of microplastics, where they come from, pathways to aquatic environments, and just a little bit about biological effects. Then I'll talk about, show some examples of microplastics in some aquatic environments where I've worked, and talk about uptake into the food web. And then I'm just going to touch on the topic of atmospheric deposition as a pathway to remote environments. And Janice will talk about that a lot more. All right, so first of all, what are microplastics? Microplastics are a really broad category spanning several orders of magnitude in size. So any plastic particle between about 5 millimeters at the large end, or about the size of a grain of rice, down to about 100 nanometers is considered a microplastic. Smaller than that, we get into nanoplastics. Up until very recently, and this depends on the lab, but up until pretty recently, the last couple of years, our analytical capability for measuring microplastics in environmental samples was, down around 300 microns or 100 microns. So we were missing a lot of what is microplastics. More recently, the capabilities have improved quite a bit in the last couple of years. And again, this varies by lab, but now labs are getting down to 1 to 10 microns, micrometers, but still, there's still microplastics that we're not able to analyze. And then the whole topic of nanoplastics we really don't have the tools yet to analyze nanoplastics in environmental samples. So in addition to this really broad size range, microplastics also vary by the shape, whether they're like a fiber shape or a spherical shape. They vary by polymer type, like polypropylene, polyethylene, polyvinyl chloride, polystyrene, et cetera. And they vary by the chemical additives that are manufactured into the plastic to give the plastic different properties. And this is things like plasticizers, flame retardants, etc. So with all this different variability, microplastics really should be thought of as a class of contaminants rather than just a single contaminant, because they vary so widely. So when we talk about types of microplastics, the categories that are commonly used are lines from things like nets or ropes or fishing lines, beads or pellets or other spherical or spheroidal objects, foams from things like styrofoam, coffee cups, takeout containers, etc. Films, which would be like flat things like like a plastic bag or plastic wrapper. Fragments is kind of like everything else. Fibers from clothing and textiles, carpet, upholstery, and tire particles from either from tire wear itself, or from chrome rubber, which is used in sports fields, or from rubberized asphalt, which is actually asphalt with tires, ground up tires built into it, manufactured into it to give the asphalt different properties. So lots of different sources of microplastics. And then here are some of the pathways that these sources reach the environment. So wastewater treatment plant discharges, land application of biosolids. A lot of the plastics that actually reach the wastewater treatment plant do get captured by the wastewater treatment plant. Like 95 to 99% get captured in the treatment plant. But they get captured in the biosolids or the sludge, and oftentimes that material gets applied over land, and so this can be really rich in microplastics, which can then get picked up by the wind or get washed into a nearby stream. Stormwater runoff from impervious surfaces like urban areas, and atmospheric deposition being other pathways. Okay, so do microplastics cause a risk to aquatic organisms? That's really the big question behind all of this. Ingestion has been observed in probably hundreds of species now. Pretty much everywhere we look, we see microplastics being ingested: marine mammals, birds, fish, turtles, invertebrates, etc. The potential risks of ingestion are both mechanical and chemical. So by mechanical, I'm talking about like clogging of feeding appendages, things like that. On the chemical side, like I mentioned before, there's a lot of additive chemicals in plastics to give them different properties. This includes things like flame retardants, alkyl phenols, antimicrobials like triclosan, plasticizers to make the plastic more supple or pliable, styrenes, antioxidants like BPA, bisphenol A. The concern here is that these chemicals, when the piece of plastic is ingested by the fish or whatever, that these chemicals might leach out into the fish and be taken up by the fish. In addition, plastic is really good at sorbing or accumulating chemicals from in the water. A lot of chemicals don't like to be in the water. They want to attach to something. And if a piece of plastic floats by, they will attach to it and accumulate on the plastic surface. So this can include things like PCBs and DDT, PAHs, different pathogens and metals. So again, the concern is then if a fish eats this piece of plastic, do these things get passed to the fish? There's the topic of biological effects has been a big topic of study in the last few years. There have been a lot of lab studies. It's honestly hard to keep up with them. There have some show no effects. I would say a lot more do show effects. Effects include things like reproduction effects, toxicity to organs like the liver. At really small scales, microplastics can pass through through the stomach lining and into the circulatory system, and even through even through cell walls and cause cellular damage. The effects in the environment are less clear because it's a lot harder to study effects in the environment because there are a lot of other confounding issues. Okay, so that's it for background. So we're going to get into microplastics in aquatic environments and uptake into the food web. So I want to start by talking about a study that I worked on in the Great Lakes. We looked at 29 of the major tributaries to the Great Lakes across 6 states, from Minnesota to New York. These watersheds ranged in land uses from very urban streams in Detroit and Milwaukee to pretty dominantly forested streams in northern Minnesota. We sampled each of these 4 times during both base flow and storm flow conditions. So here's a summary of those results. So the sites are across the bottom here, and they're ordered in increasing urban order. So the most urban streams are over on the right. And then the top of the plot is the average microplastic concentration at each of the sites. So what I want you to get out of this is just looking at the bars kind of on the right side, you see a lot more colors, meaning a lot more different plastic types. You see foams, films, pellets, beads, fragments. Most of these types of plastics are a lot more common in the urban sites. When we get to these sites at the left side of the plot, the less urban sites, mostly what we see is plastic fibers. Overall fibers dominate the samples. They were the majority of particles in all samples. If we look at this data in a little bit different way, and if you're not familiar with box plots, don't worry about it. It's just the red boxes here are urban sites, and the blue boxes are non-urban sites. And the point here is that the red urban sites have higher concentrations. And that's true for fragment-shaped microplastics, foams, films, pellets, and beads. All of these categories of microplastics, we saw higher concentrations in urban sites than we did non-urban sites. Fibers, though, microplastic fibers, we actually saw almost the same concentration at urban and non-urban sites, which is not what we expected. And it really raises the question of where are these fibers coming from? How are they getting to these non-urban, dominantly forested sites? And so that kind of raises the question of, is atmospheric deposition a potential pathway to some of these sites? Okay, now switching to a study that I worked on in Lake Mead National Recreation Area. And I actually pulled this map off of the Roaring Fork website. So here's Roaring Fork Watershed. And the Colorado River Basin is outlined in black. And Lake Mead is at the bottom or the downstream end of the Colorado River Basin. So the goals for this study of Lake Mead were to understand, and this was a project that I did with the National Park Service. Are microplastics present in Lake Mead, and do concentrations reflect human impact? In other words, do we see higher concentrations in areas where there's a lot of recreational boating or fishing? And are microplastics being ingested by aquatic organisms? So here's a map of Lake Mead showing the places that we sampled. We also sampled down in Lake Mojave. If you're not familiar with Lake Mead, this area of the lake is really the more busy area of the lake. This is Hoover Dam is right here. Effluent from Las Vegas comes in to the lake from here through Las Vegas Wash. And a lot of lot of the recreation and boating. There's a huge boat harbor right here. I think I was told it's one of the biggest in the U.S. So a lot of recreation in this area of the lake. Over here, the Colorado River comes in at Greg Basin. This is a pretty remote part of the lake. Not a lot of recreation. There's no good access other than by boat to this area. So we sampled water and sediment at all of these 9 sites, and then we sampled fish and bivalves at a subset of sites to look at, you know, a kind of impacted area versus a non-impacted area. So the way we sampled the water, and this has been kind of the traditional way of sampling water for the past 5 or 10 years. This method is starting to be outdated, which is a good thing because it's very time intensive and somewhat difficult. But basically, we sample the water by dragging a net through the water for say 15 minutes, and essentially just capturing microplastic particles in this net. And then we have to wash all those particles out of the net and transfer them to glass jars to be sampled, to be analyzed. We also sampled sediment using what's called a ponar, which is basically just this metal jaw that goes down to the lake bed and grabs sediment and brings it back up. Bivalves, we sampled 2 different types of bivalves. We sampled quagga mussels. If you're familiar with quagga mussels, they're kind of like zebra mussels. They're very small, just a few centimeters across. And we sampled those at an impacted area, Las Vegas Bay, and a less impacted area in Overton Arm. We also just happened to collect a few Asian clams in our samples. So we also analyzed those. And those are about twice the size of a quagga mussel. They're about the size of a quarter. So still pretty small. Fish, we sampled both a pelagic species and a benthic striped bass and carp. And again, we targeted bass from an impacted area in Las Vegas Bay and a less impacted area in Overton Arm to see if we could see a difference. So concentrations of microplastics in water were pretty similar to those that we saw in the Great Lakes. The highest concentration being in Las Vegas Wash, which again is the effluent from Las Vegas, so that was not a big surprise. Concentrations elsewhere were pretty low. If we compare these Lake Mead concentrations to those in the Great Lakes, you can see that Lake Mead concentrations are pretty low, you know, except for Las Vegas Wash, which is comparable to a lot of the most urban streams in the Great Lakes. Looking at microplastics and sediments, this plot shows the concentrations just by size. We see that the highest concentration in sediment was interestingly where the Colorado River comes into the lake in this really remote corner of the lake. That's Greg Basin as shown here. And you can see that it's almost entirely fibers coming in. You know, where the source of those fibers is a little bit mysterious, but I think potentially that gets back to the atmospheric deposition question or pathway. We also see we had a fair number of tire particles in our sample from the boat harbor. Here's an aerial of the boat harbor, and you can see that this break wall that they've constructed around the boat harbor is made of these giant tires. So not too surprising that we would find tire particles in here. Tires do have a number of chemicals that are not good for fish though. So this is, you know, maybe not the best thing to build your break wall out of. Comparing Lake Mead sediments to some other sediments that I've collected for other studies in the Delaware River, Lake Mead and the Delaware River were pretty similar in sediment concentrations. But if we can compare those to sediments from Milwaukee, and the scale bar is very different for this Milwaukee plot. You see the Milwaukee sediments are up to 6,000 particles per kilogram instead of 500 or 1,500. And we see a lot of tire particles in these really urban streams, sometimes dominated by tire particles. In the bivalves, concentrations, so for the Quagga mussels were so small that I thought they might not even have plastics in them. They're just so tiny. So I actually composited 10 or 11 Quagga mussels per site into one sample and took the average number. But it turned out that these Quagga mussels, especially from Las Vegas Bay, actually averaged about 12 pieces of plastic each. And again, these are like this big with 12 pieces of plastic each in them, mostly fibers. Asian clams, we only analyzed 3 of them, but they had pretty high concentrations too. One of them had over 100 pieces of plastic in it, in a clam the size of a quarter. So that was a pretty surprising result. Here are the concentrations in fish. They kind of ranged from 0 to about 18 pieces of plastic in the fish. And this is looking at the fish gut specifically. And we did see fish from this Las Vegas wash area had higher concentrations than the less impacted Overton Arm, as we would expect. So kind of putting all these sample types together just to look at what types of particles are we seeing the most of in these different sample types. Fibers were the dominant particle type across all these sample types. 69% fibers in water, up to 91% fibers in fish. Okay, so now we're going to switch gears and talk just briefly about atmospheric deposition as a pathway to remote environments. So this was a little pilot study I did with the National Park Service in North Cascades National Park. The idea was that, we thought the atmosphere might be a pathway to remote environments, but at the time there had not been any studies on this topic, and we thought, well, how can we assess this? And we decided that looking at alpine snowpack, high on a glaciated mountain where nobody is going, would be a good way to assess whether microplastics are falling down and depositing from the atmosphere. So I worked with the Park Service to collect some snow core samples from some sites like this. This is one of the glaciers that we sampled. These are very remote spots, and this was an unfunded project, so we had to get our samples opportunistically, and it required a helicopter to get here. So we only had 3 samples. The way they collected the samples was they would core vertically several meters each, and then they would melt that water, and we would then filter the water and look for microplastics in the water. The cores, even though several meters deep, that was still less than a year worth of snowpack. So we're not looking at multiple years of snowpack. This is just less than 1 year of snowpack. So here's the results from those 3 samples that we collected. Concentrations range from 10 to 30 particles per liter. Now, if you remember, my river and Lake Mead results were particles per cubic meter. So these concentrations in alpine snowpack are 100 to 1,000 times higher than what we measure in rivers and Lake Mead, and even like urban Detroit rivers. This is staggering to me. There have been some recent studies on microplastics in urban runoff. And these are exactly the ranges that people are reporting in, urban, nasty urban runoff. So really surprising. Mostly fibers, as you can see. So, it really does seem like the atmosphere is an important pathway to these remote environments. Based on this study, the Park Service North Cascades just got some additional funding to do more work on this topic, more snow coring, and also looking at sediments in high alpine lakes. So stay tuned for that. So to conclude, microplastics and especially microfibers are not limited to urban areas, but appear to be ubiquitous in aquatic environments, and they're being ingested by aquatic organisms. The effects of that ingestion are, I would say, still not well understood, but there is growing evidence that for adverse effects in aquatic organisms. And the atmosphere appears to be an important pathway to aquatic environments, atmospheric deposition. And in remote areas, the atmosphere may be the primary pathway. And certainly more research is needed on this topic. So I think I'll end there. Hopefully this is a good segue into Janice's talk on atmospheric deposition. So I guess we decided we're going to take questions after Janice. Is that right?
Yes, and there's no questions currently in the chat box. So,
so I'll stop sharing and Janice can take over.
Great, and as you are both doing that, I'll go ahead and introduce everybody to Dr. Janice Brahney. She's an assistant professor at Utah State University. She received her doctorate from the University of Colorado Boulder in environmental biogeochemistry. She holds a Master of Science degree in Earth Science and a Bachelor of Science degree in Environmental Science, both from Simon Fraser University, Burnaby, Canada. Her research sits at the nexus of several critical zone disciplines and includes three primary themes. One, the atmosphere as a vector for material transport to aquatic ecosystems. Two, climate change effects in mountain environments. And three, the cause, effect, and mitigation of water quality impairment. She has received over $2 million in research grants from a range of federal, state, and international agencies, including the National Science Foundation, Department of Energy, Utah State Division of Water Quality, Canadian Provincial Parks, the U.S. Forest Service, and the USGS. Much of Dr. Brahney's work has produced results with far-reaching implications for policy, land use regulation, and ecosystem monitoring. Her work has been cited in the IPCC and has received considerable attention from the media, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, National Geographic, Scientific American, and NPR. Dr. Brahney is currently an associate editor for Freshwater Science. So we're so excited to have you here. Dr. Brahney, Janice, turn it over to you.
Thank you, and thank you so much for having me. So I'm going to talk about atmospheric plastic deposition, and I'd like to start with a little bit of context. So we've been producing plastics since the early 1900s, but as you can see from this graph, it's been since about 1950 that we've really ramped up our global production of plastics. So in total, it's estimated that we've produced about 10 billion metric tons of plastic. And each year that production increases by about 4%. Now, much of this plastic ends up in landfills or incinerated. Some of it is recycled, but it's estimated that 12 to 18% ends up in the environment as mismanaged plastic waste. So 12 to 18%, it translates to roughly 1 billion metric tons of plastic waste since we started producing plastic. Now, since plastic is really resilient, and that's one of the things that we enjoy, one of the features that we capitalize on plastic for, it doesn't break down very easily in the environment to its base elements. So it doesn't decompose back into its various elements. Instead, it breaks down into smaller and smaller pieces until finally it's small enough to be transported in the atmosphere. So in the last just 2 years, a dozen or so papers have been published looking at atmospheric plastic deposition in very remote locations, glaciers, as Austin was talking about, different national parks, different mountain ranges, even polar regions. So one question we have to ask ourselves is, why did it take us almost 100 years to figure out that plastics were moving through the atmosphere? And it's because we do a really bad job of monitoring what is in our air. We do a really good job of monitoring particles that are smaller than 10 microns. So those are particles that are just a hair larger than a red blood cell. We care a lot about this size fraction because it can cause a lot of human health complications. So it can get lodged in lung tissue, even smaller particles can make it into your bloodstream. So we monitor the size for human health reasons, and that's where the regulations exist. This is also the size fraction that can remain aloft in the atmosphere for an extended period of time and lead to reduced visibility. It's that smog size fraction. We do a pretty good job of measuring rain chemistry, and we measure gases really well. But the bulk of the mass of material that is in the atmosphere is between 20 and 250 microns in size. And we aren't measuring this fraction comprehensively at all. And so we have a really poor understanding of what the material is in the atmosphere and what it's composed of.
Janice, I'm so sorry to interrupt you. We have a question. Is the metric you're using referred to as PM10 as well?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Less than 10 microns is also referred to as PM10, and less than 2.5 microns is PM2.5. So you've probably seen a lot of discussion around PM10 and PM2.5.
Thank you.
So this huge gap in our understanding of what's in the atmosphere is what my research has been trying to fill for the last 10 years or so. And so one of the ways I wanted to approach this was to partner with an existing monitoring network. And so that's the National Atmospheric Deposition Program that I've been working with. Here is a map of all of their different sites across North America. They have over 300 stations in the United States. And they measure rain chemistry every Tuesday. So it's an enormous program, it's an enormous effort, but provides an amazing wealth of data. So this is a standard NADP station. This is in Colorado at Gothic in the East River watershed. And as you can see, there's a lot of different instruments here. But this table here with the 2 buckets on it is their wet, dry atmospheric chemistry sampler. And so early in the inception of the National Atmospheric Deposition Program, they were really interested in measuring acid deposition. And so they thought that they could perhaps use this dry bucket to measure dry fall of acids. And then it was quickly realized that that wasn't feasible. And so since then, they haven't really been using this dry bucket. And so I thought this is one way that I could leverage this existing network to build in a particulate measuring program. So as you can see, there's 2 buckets. There's the dry bucket, which is open to the atmosphere. When this picture was taken, it's not raining. And then there's another bucket in the back that has a lid on it. And so when it rains, it triggers this sensor that moves the lid over the dry bucket, and then it'll rain into the rain bucket. And then there's a heater in that sensor. So when it stops raining, the sensor will dry and it'll move the lid back over to the rain bucket. And so that way we can capture both dry fall of particulates as well as rainfall of particulates. And so I developed a sampler that can fit into the dry bucket that it will allow me to capture particulate deposition while acting as a wind baffle and preventing contamination from things like bugs or leaves or twigs that might happen to blow into the sampler. And so we started this study at 11 sites across the Western United States, including several sites in Colorado. And with this large network, I recognized that I could use this to start to ask and answer a lot of really important questions about plastics and how plastics are moving through the atmosphere. So I could quantify how much plastic is coming out of the sky under rain, so with undercloud scavenging with rain, or how much was falling out as dry fall. I wanted to know if we could use this data to understand how far plastic is traveling. Can we identify the major sources of plastic to the atmosphere? And what commodities are we seeing in our different plastic that we're identifying? So just to give you a little bit of a sense of what dust is made of, I was really interested in understanding how dust moves different compounds to remote systems. So I take a lot of pictures of dust under the microscope. And so you can see there's some bits of bugs, there's some minerals, and also a fiber, a plastic fiber, plastic particles, amongst other natural fragments. Here you can see a microbead as well as some plastic film. And I was able to capture images of microbeads in every color of the rainbow, multicolored different particles, as well as fibers in every color of the rainbow. So what I did with this data is that from November of 2017 to February 2019, so a period of about 14 months, I quantified the amount of plastic that was in both wet fall as well as dry fall. I measured the length and the width of the fibers and the diameter of the particles. I classified them as either primary microplastics, and so those are plastics that were formed in that size fraction. So a microbead is an example of a primary microplastic, or a secondary microplastic, which is from the breakdown of some larger commodity source. And that allowed me to determine the deposition rate in terms of particles per meter squared per year. But because I had the dimensions of all of my particles, I was also able to translate that into a mass per meter squared per year. In addition to the visual count, so I did most of this through visual counting. I counted over 10,000 individual fibers and several thousand particles. And then with a subset of those, I used FTIR to identify what the different polymer types we were seeing. So I used two different methods, one where I very painstakingly used a very steady hand to pick very tiny pieces of plastic and fibers out of my samples to move them to the FTIR instrument so that we could analyze what their composition were. So some examples are here on the right. You can see some serines, some polyethylenes, and polyethyramide. And this was a very challenging process. Sometimes you would pick up a piece of plastic and it would shatter, or it would fling out of your tweezers, or by the time you made it to the FTIR instrument, it had magically disappeared. So a second technique that I then used more intensively was a particle mapping technique. And here I could take all of my sample, so the entire mixed aerosol sample, and mass identify the particles in the sample. And so this allowed me then to determine how much of my sample was mineral, how much was organic, and how much was polymer. So to try to understand where these plastics were coming from, I used a couple of different techniques. And the first is using back trajectory models. So these are atmospheric models that can tell you where the air mass was coming from before it arrived at your site. So I ran these models for 48 hours for every single day for every single site of my study. So here's an example where we have our site in Rocky Mountain National Park, and this blue line is tracking the atmospheric path of the air mass before it arrived at our site. And so then I could use this data to understand whether or not those air masses were intersecting with major population centers, what the total population, the air mass intersected with using population GIS data, what the wind speeds were, and how far that wind had traveled within that 48-hour period. And then I also used other properties of the dust itself to give me a clue as to where the samples might be coming from. So first was using a total mass of dust deposition. Does that align with plastics, or does it, or is it inversely related to plastic composition? Also, the composition of that dust, did we see relationships to sodium and chloride, which might indicate a marine source of atmospheric plastics? And then the last thing I did was look at how the plastic deposition rates in space and time relate to broad climate patterns. So I looked at how the location of the jet stream might influence plastic deposition, or other broad climate proxies that can tell us something about northern hemisphere air movement. Okay, so how much plastic is in dust? Well, a lot. So as you can see from this one particular image, there's a lot of very brightly colored pieces of plastic that are very easy to visually pick out by eye and measure their properties. But there are a lot of other potential fragments that would be harder to be certain visually. So for example, you can see there's a little bit of charcoal here and down here, but then we have this piece here. Is that charcoal? Is it a piece of a bug? Is it a piece of a tire? That's very difficult to discern visually. So with this FTIR particle mapping technique, I was able to take a sample like this and determine what proportion of this sample was in fact plastics. And when we did this, we found that between 2 and 6% of our particles were plastic, and on average about 4%. And so that's slightly larger than what I was counting by my visual estimates, suggesting that there are a lot of things that are quite difficult to identify visually. And 4% might sound small, but I want to remind you that it's actually very huge. So this is 4% of all the aerosols that are in the atmosphere. So that's a really sizable, significant number. In terms of what these plastics were composed of, the majority of the dry and wet deposition were fibers. So this aligns with what Austin was saying, that in their most remote locations, they're finding mostly fibers. So about 70% of what we were seeing were fibers that consisted of, things that, clothing that gets a bad rap often, like technical gear, but also very common everyday clothing, things like nylon and polyester were a large proportion of what we were seeing in the fibers. I classified particles separately, and about 30% of the particles were primary microbeads. So these very brightly colored microbeads that you see here. And we've heard a lot about how different cosmetics might use microbeads, and that's leading to the widespread microbead pollution in the environment. But the microbeads I was seeing here were much smaller than what we typically see in cosmetics. So cosmetic microbeads are usually about 100 microns in size. These microbeads that I was finding were between 10 and 30 microns in size, so much, much smaller, and in all colors of the rainbow. And if you go to the websites of the manufacturers of these microbeads, they say who they sell to. And so they primarily sell to scientists and the medical community. So these microbeads often fluoresce. And so they're used a lot in medical applications for things like calibrating different instruments, as well as in sciences using in different feeding studies. But the clear pathway from these activities to the environment is not very clear, since a lot of medical waste is incinerated, for example. A minor purchaser of these microbeads are paint companies. So a lot of paints use microbeads to add different visual effects and different textures. And so we think that this might be where a lot of these microbeads are coming from, since a lot of industrial paints are applied through aerosol sprays. And the few that we were able to identify were acrylic. And so this again points to paint as a potential source of this microplastic. I also saw a lot of what looked like labels. So labels from plastic Coke bottles, for example, where you could see one side was white and the other side had multiple colors on it, often in the red, blue, and black color scheme. So in terms of the drivers, so where do we think these microplastics are coming from? So using these air mass trajectories, I was able to show that cities and large urban centers do appear to be contributing a lot of microplastics to the atmosphere. And I'll give you an example. So our highest wet deposition rate was recorded at Rocky Mountain National Park, which was also our closest site to an urban center. And that particular week, we recorded 300 plastics per meter square per day. And as you can see from the air mass trajectories, that 4 of the 7 days were upslope events where the air mass passed through the Denver Fort Collins area before arriving at Rocky Mountain National Park. As you can see in the bottom corner here, the 48-hour trajectories are quite long, so the air mass was moving fast. The wind speeds were relatively high during that week. In contrast, our smallest deposition rate was recorded at Grand Canyon. And as you can see, the air masses did not travel very far. It was a very slow moving air, and they did not pass through any major urban centers. And so that week we recorded deposition rates that were 5 plastics per meter squared per day. But note, there was still a background plastic deposition rate, despite the fact that air was moving slowly and it didn't intersect with population centers. So just about every sample we had microplastics in it. So we also saw this interesting positive relationship in wet deposition to plastic concentration. So I'll note that our wet deposition results were very different than our dry deposition results, indicating that the sources and pathways for these 2 different types of deposition are very different. So in our wet deposition, we saw this positive relationship with dust. And so what we think is happening is that soil mobility is redistributing plastics across the environment. And as Austin was saying, we think agricultural sources might be one of the bigger culprits because about 50% of the biosolids that are produced in this country are used as fertilizer in agricultural fields. And wastewater treatment plants are really efficient at retaining those microplastics in that solid fraction. So as a result, the biosolids that are produced tend to have a lot of microplastics in them. So there's a lot of potential then for agricultural soils in the West in particular to be remobilized during processes like tilling. This positive association with dust in the wet deposition also told us that this interesting phenomena is happening, which we called plastic spiraling, and we borrowed that term from nutrient spiraling in streams. And this is the idea that plastics might have a different lifetime, a certain lifetime in the atmosphere. So say they're emitted directly to the atmosphere from a paint spray, and then it might travel some distance before it lands on some soil, and it might spend some time in that soil, and then along comes some big winds, which might remobilize that plastic and some soil back into the atmosphere, and it might have another atmospheric lifetime, and it might end up in the ocean, and so on and so forth. And so in this way, plastics are just bouncing around the surface of the earth. So to summarize with the wet deposition, if we saw more dust in our sample, we saw more plastic. If the air masses moved through major population centers, we saw more plastic. If neither of those things, we saw very low plastic concentrations. And so what this is telling us is that when we have rain events, we also tend to have big storm events. And so these storm events can generate a lot of energy that can pick up that material and mobilize and move that material to where it can be rained out and rained out from below the clouds. So this is what we call below cloud scavenging. Dry deposition, however, was really different in its associations than what we saw with wet deposition. So first we noticed that dry deposition was a lot smaller in size than wet deposition. And so that's very intuitively tells you that dry deposition can be coming from much farther away. Larger particles are not going to have the same atmospheric lifetime. They're going to fall out of the atmosphere more rapidly, whereas small particles can travel much longer distances. And the size fractions that we saw are certainly within the range of long range, even global transport. We saw an inverse relationship with dust. So if we had a lot of dust in our sample, we did not have a lot of plastic. If we had little dust in our sample, we had lots of plastic. And so what that's telling us is that the processes that move dust around the surface of the Earth at a regional scale could be displacing these air masses from higher up in the atmosphere. We also saw a positive relationship to elevation. So the higher in elevation our site was, we had a lot of sites that were on the top of mountains, the more plastic deposition we saw. Again, that's telling us that the plastics that are falling out dry are moving around high in the atmosphere. And finally, we saw this relationship to the location of the jet stream and other large-scale climate indices. And so if the jet stream was dipping very far south and intersecting with most of our sites, we tended to see more plastic deposition. And what all of this data together is telling us is that plastics are moving in what's called the free troposphere. So much higher in the atmosphere, where we see a lot of our storms, our clouds. Above clouds, we have plastics moving around in the atmosphere. And so that's really frightening. We also saw more dry deposition than wet deposition. So the dry deposition rates were much higher than the wet deposition rates. So and with dry deposition deposition coming from higher in the atmosphere with the capacity to move around the surface of the Earth or the globe between continents. What that's telling us is that our garbage, our waste is so prevalent in the environment that we don't even know where these particles are coming from. So in terms of the total deposition, because I measured those particle sizes, I was able to convert them into mass and look at the mass deposition rates. And so you can see that our largest deposition site was Rocky Mountain National Park. Again, it's very close to some major urban centers, which probably plays a role in the deposition rates being so high. But you can see that the deposition rates are fairly substantial for all of these remote locations. Within each of the national park or wilderness areas, we quantified what the annual mass of plastic deposition was. And as you can see, it ranges from 0.2 to about 12 tons of plastic per year. If we extrapolate to all of the Western protected areas, that's between 1 and 2,500 tons per year. So that's 1,000 to 2,400 tons per year. That's an enormous amount of plastic falling out of the sky. And these estimates are based on our visual counts. I did briefly mention before that when we used the FTIR mapping technique, we ended up with slightly higher concentrations. And so our estimates based on our FTIR analysis range from 1,000 to 4,000 tons per year for all Western protected areas. So how are microplastics getting into the atmosphere? This is a really big question. So unlike particles that are smaller than 10 microns, larger particles need some mechanical means of entering the atmosphere. So PM10 and below can be directly emitted to the atmosphere from combustion or can form in the atmosphere through different atmospheric chemical reactions. But dust particles and plastic particles that are larger need to be mechanically emitted to the atmosphere. So we need to figure out what are the major emission points into the atmosphere, which is different than the sources to the environment. So one potential source is through the marine environment. So plastics tend to be about the density of water or lighter. And so wave action and bubble burst action is a potential mechanism to move plastics into the atmosphere where they can be transported long distances. And again, we did see this positive association to sodium and chloride, which does indicate that for some of our sites, at least, we might be seeing what's coming off the marine environment. We found this positive association with wet deposition and plastic with soil dust. And so we think that agriculture could be a significant source to the atmosphere, or agricultural soils that are being eroded. And then we also think roads are a potentially major source to the atmosphere. So the thing about cities is that they don't have a lot of fetch. So there's a lot of buildings and that can disrupt airflow. So it can be difficult to take what is produced in a city and move it really far into the atmosphere. So cities tend to have really high dust deposition rates internally that are about an order of magnitude higher than what we see in the wilderness. But because it's not moving high into the atmosphere, it's not moving far away from those cities in general. Roads, on the other hand, provide a lot of fetch. So they're long and they're linear, so that allows winds to pick up speeds along roads. But also cars driving on roads provide that mechanical energy to move particles high into the atmosphere where they can then be carried. And you can see from this image that it's a car driving on a dirt road that there is a huge plume of dust being picked up high enough where winds can then transport those particles really far. So, and this is not just tire particles or road particles that are being picked up. If you look at road dust in cities or near cities, what you'll see is all kinds of plastics. You'll see microbeads, you'll see fibers, you'll see plastics from all kinds of commodities that are in this road dust. And so roads, we think, are one of the major sources of moving plastics into the atmosphere. So the next step that I wanted to take with this research was to partner with an atmospheric modeler. So I'm not an atmospheric modeler, so I partnered with one who can take the data that I generated and the atmospheric processes that were occurring at that time, and so that we can test these different hypotheses as to where plastic might be coming from, to see what the model picks out as our most likely candidates based on air mass movement at the time. And so we did this with my data, and what we found is that dominantly it does seem like roads are the main drivers of our plastic deposition. So for our western sites, roads accounted for 84% of what we saw in the deposition. Sea spray was about 11%. Agricultural soils were only about 5%, but a lot of my sites are not near major agricultural areas in the United States. And urban centers didn't come out as being really important. And we think that's because though urban centers might produce a lot of plastic waste, it's the roads that are generating the movement of plastics into the atmosphere. And since there does tend to be high density of roads near cities, but also elsewhere, the roads came out as a better predictor of plastic deposition than cities did. And we estimated that the atmospheric burden of plastics at any given time in the Western United States is about 1,000 tons. So we used this data then to extrapolate across the globe, which is a pretty big extrapolation, but it's the first time anything like this has ever been done. And so we're trying to understand where we should be sampling and what we might expect to find if we were to measure atmospheric deposition of plastics elsewhere. And we wanted to also compare our model to data that has been generated elsewhere. However, a lot of the data that's generated elsewhere has tended to sample over long periods of time and sample both wet and dry deposition together, which then makes it harder to tease apart which processes might be occurring. But here are the results of this model, and this is a publication that's in review, so please don't share widely. Or at all. And as you can see, the ocean, we think, plays a really big role globally in moving plastics into the atmosphere. And this is partly because the oceans are so polluted with plastics that there's a lot of source there. Agricultural dust played a bigger role in other parts of the world. Roads map to population density. And then there's this other interesting and difficult to explain example here called population dust. And so this is a term that's used to indicate dust that is produced near urban centers, as opposed to what is actually people dust. It's dust near urban centers, if that makes sense. And so we are starting to ask a lot of new and interesting questions about how plastics are entering the atmosphere to begin with, how far they are traveling, and what the major sources are, which can help us identify different actions to try and limit those sources to the atmosphere. And with that, I'll finish. Thank you.
Thank you, Janice. Thank you both, Austin and Janice. So we have a couple of questions. I'm going to go ahead and on the first one here for you. So your first question is from Matthew Green. Are there any positive effects of microplastics on aquatic organisms? For example, do they increase habitat variability? And have organisms shown any adaptive capacity to dealing with microplastics, or are the effects just generally negative?
I'll take a stab at that one, and Janice, you can add on if you have thoughts too. I've not seen any studies, reporting positive effects. Like for habitat, I think plastics are maybe too small or microplastics are too small for creating habitat. You do see like the big garbage patches in the oceans creating these sad habitats for fish. But I haven't seen any evidence of positive effects or adaptations. Adaptations may be out there, but I haven't seen any studies on it.
I think a recent paper came out, which is in my queue to read, that was talking about, and it must be large pieces of plastic creating habitats in river environments, but that must be, enormous pieces and not really the microplastics that we're talking about. But there are a lot of studies that show that microplastics can change the microbial community within different ecosystems, marine, terrestrial, freshwater, with the microbes that colonize the microplastics. And that's generally of concern, because if you change the microbial community, you change fundamentally how maybe nutrients might be cycling in that system. And so that can lead to, there is a study showing a decrease in bioavailable phosphorus in soils that contain a lot of plastics. And so even though it might be favoring certain species over other, it doesn't generally tend to be something we want to see or very positive.
Okay, thank you. Okay, here's the next question from Newshound. Curious about ski and snowboard wax. Are those particles considered microplastics or nanoplastics? And have any of those been detected in mountain streams or waterways?
So most ski and snowboard waxes are made from paraffin, which it's like a petroleum product. So I think that would be considered a type of plastic. So as that gets broken off of your skis in small pieces, micro or nano, then I have to imagine it ends up in waterways. I think one of the other concerns with snowboard and ski wax is the fluorocarbons that are often added, basically like a Teflon chemical that are added to ski waxes to make them really slippery and slidey and hydrophobic. And those are probably a more concerning chemical from a toxicity perspective.
So I'm looking up the name, but this is a little fun segue here. Someone that lives really close to us in Carbondale, and used to be one of our river stewards, which is a young adult professional group that we have associated with the Roaring Fork Conservancy, Peter Arlen actually started a company called Mountain Flow Eco Wax, which is addressing this very thing. And so I'm pretty sure his wax is plant-based. But, and he was on Shark Tank on Friday night and actually got a deal from 2 of the sharks to grow his company. So you all can go check it out. It's called Mountain Flow Eco Wax, and he does have a Facebook page. I was just looking up the name to make sure make sure I got that name. So that was a fun little segue into that. I didn't know, Janice, if there was anything else you wanted to add to that. Okay, so a couple more questions. Oh, this is from Gettings is the name I have. Do we know much about the risks to humans ingesting the fish that have microplastics in them?
I don't think we, and maybe Janice is up on some of this, but I don't think we know much about that, partly because only until, very recently could we get down to those really small particle sizes. So like the fish that I was looking at, the stomachs of, we were looking at particles like down to 100 microns. And in general, those particles are not gonna pass through the gut wall and into the muscle tissue, which, generally we don't eat the gut of the fish, we eat the muscle tissue. But at that's really those smaller particles and the nanoparticles, those do get into the circulatory system and can accumulate in tissues. So I think those are the ones that are probably potentially more concerning for human consumption. But we're just getting to the point where we can look at that. Mussels, I'll just, before Janice jumps in, if she's going to, mussels and oysters and things like that, we eat the whole thing, so in that case, we are eating whatever's in that mussel, we're eating it. But I haven't seen a lot of studies on the human health risks.
Yeah, I think they're only starting to come out, and it's a little bit early to draw strong conclusions from a handful of studies. With respect to inhalation, any particle can be of a certain size, can be irritating to your lung tissue. There was a study, the first study that identified microfibers, plastic fibers in lung tissue actually came out in 1998. And the author noted that these fibers were a lot longer and larger than what we typically see lodged in lung tissue, because it's generally assumed that particles less than 10 microns get lodged in lung tissue, but anything larger, we have the capacity to expel. And he saw fibers that were 100 microns, 150 microns in length. And so he postulated that plastics might be biopersistent. They might spend a longer time in our bodies because they're foreign and our bodies are maybe unfamiliar with how to expel them. And since then, there hasn't been a remarkable amount of research. There's been some work on flock workers and their inhalation of plastics and leading to different pulmonary diseases. But they have really high exposure rates compared to the average population. And so at this point, it's just unclear what role plastics might be playing in lung health, for example.
Janice, on this topic, before we move to a different topic, you mentioned that plastics were 4% of dust. I assume that was outdoor dust, and I'm wondering if you know how indoor dust compares.
Yeah, that was outdoor dust. So indoor dust is going to have way more plastics than outdoor dust. So your exposure indoors will be much worse.
Right.
Wow. Okay, thank you. Thank you both. Okay, we have a question from Ellen Campbell, and she is asking if there is any relation to trash incinerator locations or concentrations as far as pathways for microplastics to enter the atmosphere.
Well, plastics have a really relatively low melting point. I don't know anyone who's tried to look at emissions from incinerators and whether or not there's any microplastics in them. But since plastics have such a low melting point, my guess is that isn't a major source to the atmosphere. But that's just a guess.
Yeah, that's a really good point too. Okay, ready for the next question. This is from April Long. Why are fibers the more prevalent type of microplastics? Their shape and composition are more easily transported. Are they simply the more prevalent type of plastic manufactured?
That's a good question. They are, because they have a lot of surface area compared to their density and their width, they are easily transported in the atmosphere. There's a lot of drag that can allow them to be transported. In terms of where all of our commodity waste is coming from, I'm less familiar with that, but it seems like a lot of those fibers are coming from clothing.
Okay. So I guess that answers the question from Olivia, who asked, are the majority of the plastics you found in your samples from textiles? Okay. So one more question. Do plastic bottles break down to fragments?
Yeah. Like a lot of the household trash that's not like a plastic bag or a wrapper would break down to what we normally call a fragment. Like
okay.
Bottles and plastic jars and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. So I'm gonna there's still a lot of people on this call. If you have any more questions, please, I encourage you to throw them in the chat box, but I'm gonna ask a question. I'm gonna ask like a two-part question. So the first question I have is, as we're seeing an increase in wildfires, especially out in the West, are we seeing any correlation with the impact, influence that wildfires and smoke has on atmospheric availability of the microplastics? And then the second question I have is more related to, it seems that microplastics are just prevalent. They're everywhere, and it's a little bit disheartening. And what advice do you guys have for everyone here listening and anyone who will be watching this recording later? Like, what can we do? Like, what can we do at this point?
So again, because plastics have such a low melting point, my guess is that fires would tend to incinerate a lot of the plastics in the soils or the vegetation that's being burned. We have seen a reduction in microplastics through this past summer, which might be COVID related because there are less people driving on roads. In terms of what we can do about it, I think that at every level of government and every individual needs to make different choices, whether it be limit, not falling prey to fast fashion, not using single-use plastics. I think there needs to be regulation on single-use plastics, finding alternatives, new technologies that can limit fiber emissions from washing machines or dryers, identifying which industrial processes produce a lot of fibers. I think a lot of blame is placed on individual households, but it's likely that there's some industrial processes that are the dominant producers of fibers that are getting emitted to the environment. I think we need to learn a lot more about how plastics end up in the environment before we can really target exactly how to limit them. But I think also there's a lot of decisions, personal decisions and policy decisions that can help.
Yeah, I agree with everything Janice just said. I think that, people can kind of apply their consumer pressure and their pressure, like public pressure on legislators. And I think a really good example of that is in 2014, there was this, or 2013, there was a study on the Great Lakes, and they found a lot of microbeads in those Great Lakes samples. And, you know, there was an immediate and loud public outcry. And, you know, within a couple of years, there was a national ban on the use of these microbeads in personal care products for, you know, like scrubbing type purposes. So I think, you know, I think that consumers can apply their pressure and make change. You know, another example is some of the clothing companies like Patagonia are looking into re-engineering their fabrics to shed less plastic. And, you know, again, that's a consumer pressure thing, because they know that their consumers want that. So.
Yeah, and I think that's really important for industry leaders to pave the way for those types of technologies. But we also need, like, it can't just be the wealthy that can afford Patagonia that can, you know, stop wearing clothes that might pollute the environment. We need those technologies to be accessible to everyone.
Right, I agree. But those wealthy companies might have to be the ones to lead, develop the technology, and then others adopt it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So I guess these two questions maybe could be combined. How do you characterize different types of plastic in soil, air, and water in terms of their chemical composition? And then somebody else asked, what about wearing clothes made from natural fibers like cotton and wool? Is that like an easy solution to start with, I guess?
I don't know if I understand the first question. The second question, I think we can definitely wear more cotton and wool, but I think we should be careful that, you know, those also have their environmental effects. You know, wool doesn't come for free. It requires sheep, and sheep have their effects on the environment. And so, you know, then it becomes okay, well, and cotton requires fertilizer. And so it becomes a little bit almost an impossible question of like, what's the least harmful option, right? And I don't know the answer to that.
Mm-hmm. What I could do is, Amy saying, if you're on here and listening, that was your question about the first question, how do you characterize different types of plastics? If you wouldn't mind unmuting yourself, Amy, maybe you can ask that question a little bit more.
Yeah, I'm a professor of chemistry and biochemistry. We study microplastics effects on human cells, especially lung cells. So we are wondering, when we collect samples from soil and from water, from sand, we are in Florida, let's say if we collect samples from Florida beaches, and how do you use I know Janet mentioned, one of the method, the spectroscopic method, but that one, is that the standard method? What other methods like Raman spectroscopy and the other methods you can use to characterize the chemical composition of the mix of the plastics?
Yeah, so FTIR is just one method. Raman spectroscopy is another method, which can actually get down to smaller particle sizes than FTIR, but it takes longer than FTIR. There's also some new techniques. So you can use pyrolysis GCMS, which will incinerate it'll burn the plastics, and you can identify the different polymer compositions that way. Though unlike FTIR and Raman, you need to create your own calibration if you're using a GCMS, whereas the FTIR has a library of different spectral signatures that can be related back to different polymer types. And then there's a new technique called thermal desorption GCMS, or I guess it's new for plastics, where it heats up the sample, but it doesn't fully pyrolyze it. And so the gases that come off heating the plastics can then be identified. And you can identify the polymer type, but this also allows you to identify the different contaminants that might be on the plastics themselves.
All right. I think I may email you or contact you later. So we don't take too much time from the other audience now. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. And for those of you that are interested, I'm just noticing the time. We have about 3 minutes left, and I want to respect your time. And I know Janice has to go as well. But if you want to get in touch with Janice, you can see her email address on her photo, on her video there, where her name would be. We are also going to, these presentations have been recorded, so they will be available on our YouTube channel later today. And I just added the link to that in the chat box. And so I really want to thank all of you for being here today and taking the time to learn about this. This is really important and critical. And I think we're going to be hearing a lot more from Janice and Austin in the future. And we're really grateful to you. And I mean, this is hours and hours of travel and research and writing some more to get more funding to do more research so that we can learn more. And we really appreciate the work that you're doing and sharing with all of us. So I want to invite all of you to join us we have 2 more Berkshire Watershed Institute presentations coming up. One will be in 2 weeks on February 25th, and it will be about the Grizzly Creek wildfire, estimating post-fire watershed response. And so I'm sending a link for that here as well. And then on March 10th, we're going to have Carl Wetlauer from NRCS, who's a snow surveyor for the state, talking to us about our monitoring mountain snowpack for water supply forecasting and beyond. So please feel free to check out our website to learn more about these presentations, about any of the other work that we're doing. And if you happen to be in this part of Colorado, we invite you to stop by and say hello. For those of you that maybe have some more questions, more one-on-one type questions, Austin said he can stay on this call for a couple more minutes, but Janice does have to run. So thank you again, Janice and Austin. We're so appreciative. Your gifts are in the mail, and we'll be in touch. So thank you, everybody, for coming.
Yeah, thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Austin, I don't know if you want to hang on for a moment with me.
Sure.
Let's just see if there's any more questions as folks are logging off. That was really great. Really, really great. Thanks so much to you both.
Yeah, that was fun.
Yeah.
I was familiar with Janice's work, but I hadn't seen it actually fully presented. So that was really fascinating.
Yeah, it was so great and so understandable. Both of your presentations were really, really great. Have you been able to travel a lot over the last year to do your field work, or has that also been limited now?
Yeah, I do. I haven't flown anywhere, but I have some field work that's drivable. None microplastics, but I have like some other, like mercury and some other projects that I've been able to work on. So yeah. Great.
Okay, we have a couple more people on the call. You are welcome to unmute yourself and ask your questions if interested. Austin, I also wanted to let you know one of your colleagues said that they heard about this presentation through the USGS Microplastics Integrated Science Team. They shared the announcement. So
good.
Yeah.
I didn't know that was shared.
This is great. All right, well, it looks like we don't have any more questions.
Okay.
So we're gonna go ahead and log off. Thanks, Austin.
Right, well, thanks again.
In a couple of days. So thank you again.
Yeah, it was fun.
Hopefully. Yeah, it was fun. Thanks, Austin. Right. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.